Hey there, Anthony Lee Phillips here, Anthony Writes Fantasy. I wanted to do a quick series on story structure. There are certainly other story paradigms, especially when you look at other cultures, but the three-act story structure, as it used to be called, and what I think is better known as like the four-quarter structure, um, just super, super useful. Um, it sort of serves as a roadmap, and I'm a big believer that content dictates form. Whatever you're writing about should change how you tell that story, and then how you tell the story tells the story again, in a way. That's what I like to do, and so looking at this concrete story structure with very specific scenes and so on, for me, it gives me some freedom because I don't have to follow any of these rules because they're not rules. It's tools, not rules. This is just a wrench in my toolbox. And if for some reason I don't want there to be a disruption scene, I can invert that, and it's gonna feel different. It's gonna feel very different. But anyways, I really like to use this, and this is actually the first place that I go when I'm planning out a story, and it's the paradigm that I'm using to write the 3 books that I'm writing right now. You can use these in any genre. There are a lot of variations of this. You can learn this in a lot of places, but I find that a lot of the terms, like say inciting incident, for example, that's a term that I don't like. It doesn't make any sense. I understand that it's an important moment, but I would rather call it a disruption because that's what's happening to the character. Inciting incident just makes it, like, what is it inciting? It's inciting the rest of the story, but like, it's not a visceral term, and that's important to me. That's something that I think when you're creating your own paradigm, your own version of a structure, or if you decide to do away with this, you should come up with whatever the term is that's going to make it most visceral to you, because that's what's going to actually impact the way that you tell your story. The scene is the domain of the writer, and I think that's true. If you're going to practice anything, I think really going in and saying this big story structure is a collection of scenes. And so when I'm going to practice writing scenes. Like, my hope is that this will be useful for writers for actual creation rather than analysis, which is mostly what story structure tends to be used for. To think about it, this is Charlotte. This is my cat. Hi, Charlotte. Say hi. I'm hoping in the future to take this paradigm after I've done this video, and then to actually have a few videos where I say, okay, I'm gonna write a fantasy style story using this paradigm, and here's what it looks like when I actually do that. And so hopefully that'll be interesting and useful, and then hopefully you feel like you can do that too. Like, doing it live is kind of fun, like, just go on Twitch and be like, I'm gonna outline a novel, and then the next day I'm gonna write one of the scenes in that outline. I don't know. So here we go. Let's dig into it. Let's look at the 4-quarter story structure paradigm. All right, so Charlotte's got her little pen. She's got her notebook open. And what we're going to do is we are first going to decide how long our thing is going to be. So I'm just, as a default, going to say 80,000 words, which is 40 chapters. If 500 words is a page, and 2,000 words is a chapter. All right, so I'm just doing that just to give myself a goal. This will probably not be what it is in the end, but that's just where I'm beginning. Okay, so we've got page 1, and then we've got page 160, which I think is what that comes out to. This is what I prepared earlier. And this is your book. This is the progress bar, if you're Brandon Sanderson. Now, let's take a look at story structure. Sorry, I'm not really looking at where my phone is. Yeah? What do you think, Charlotte? Oh, she's playing with it. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we are going to split this in half. And we're going to call that the midpoint scene. And then each of these halves, we're going to split in half. So, 25% of the way through, we have the point of no return scene. And then 3/4 of the way through, we have stepping into the ring scene. You don't have to call these things. Some people call this plot point 1 and plot point 2, or you'll also get like point of no return 1, point of no return 2. It can also be called like stepping through the gate on either side. And we'll sort of get into more of what that is. But the basic idea of this is we've got Act 1, which goes up to the point of no return. Act 2, the point of no return to the midpoint scene. Act 3, which is the midpoint scene until they step into the ring to fight the villain or the antagonistic force, whichever is, whichever your story's about. It could be, I'm going to actually confront my trauma. That's a great example of like an internal villain, quote unquote. And then from 75%, from that stepping into the ring scene until the end of your book, we have Act 4. And you can name these. I think Sean Coyne says this is setup, build up, breakdown, resolution, or climax. I can't remember which one he calls it. And those are honestly pretty good names for those. But the basic thing is you've basically got these 4 stories that make up this one big story. And the midpoint scene is at the very, very center. And this is the sort of structural foundation of the 4/4 structure. You've got these 4 quarters, these 4 acts. Now in Act 1, like I said, we call this the setup. This is also where your disruption happens. And this is also where what some people call like the argument or the debate is. I like to call it opposition, which is what Alan Watt from the 90-Day Novel and LA Writers Club calls it, or LA Writers Lab, I mean. He calls it opposition. Antagonism is opposition. I love that. I think that's very visceral. Act 2 is called the build-up. People also call it the upside-down world, and I actually like that a little better. But build-up is sort of a better word when you're looking at Act 3, which is breakdown. And we'll go over why that is in just a moment. Act 4 is either climax or resolution. I'm just going to call it climax and... climax and resolution. Sorry, I'm very new to this. Okay, so we've got the basics of this. We've got from page 1 to quarter in, halfway through, 75%, and at the end. All right, let's talk a little bit about this midpoint scene, because the midpoint is everything. So for me, I think the crux of this structure is the midpoint. Now, what is a midpoint? The midpoint is where your hero, or your protagonist in the first half, they're hit with a problem somewhere in Act 1, a disruption, and they're like, okay, well, let me solve this problem. And then they hit the midpoint and they say, this problem is huge. This problem is much bigger than I thought it was going to be, which I think they say in X-Men Days of Futures Past, in a really cheesy way, like, oh, I've never thought of this before. The midpoint is where the world suddenly gets bigger. Frodo realizes, no, I'm not going to be able to go back to the Shire. I will do it. I will take the ring to Mordor. He's no longer facing a problem as he was in the first act and the second act. He's now facing a dilemma, and he's going to have to pick a side on this dilemma, which means that he is going to lose something when he makes this choice. This is a moment, Alan Watt calls it temptation and commitment, which I love. But it doesn't have to look like that, which is why I don't call it that. It's just a really great way to think about it. Frodo is tempted to return home and live a safe, happy life, but he commits himself to doing the right thing instead. You can also look at this in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban has a great example of a midpoint, and I'm just going to spoil it for you here, but I mean, deal with it. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, in the film, this is the moment that he realizes that Sirius Black betrayed his father and his mother. And of course, that's false information. We learn the real information at this stepping into the ring scene. But at the midpoint, that's what he thinks is true, and it changes the whole trajectory of his emotional journey. He goes from a passive hero to an active hero, or he goes from a passive NPC basically up until this point. And he says, when I find him, I'm going to kill him. And that's a great example of a midpoint. The world gets bigger. We also see that the midpoint, a lot of times it shows the hero making the wrong decision with the right information. I think it's Ellen Brock says, the hero might come to the midpoint and they're seeing reality, but they're misinterpreting reality. They think that this is their epiphany moment. They're like, no, this is what the truth is, but they have a lot of suffering to do before they actually get to an epiphany moment, which happens right before they step into the ring. So the midpoint is such an incredible tool. I would say, if you take nothing else away, every scene, every story that I love has a midpoint. You can look at an episode of Friends, and right in the middle of the episode, suddenly someone's problem, they think they've solved it, and it turns out that it's a dilemma. It's not actually a problem at all. It's a dilemma, and they're going to have to make a choice. They have to figure out a new way out of this, and they're going to have to get creative about it. Usually it's Ross being an idiot, but they're all idiots sometimes, so there's that. So, just to recap, I know we're going to be doing a lot of that. First 25%, the first 10 chapters. We've got Act 1, setup, disruption, opposition, and then there's a scene where it's the point of no return, and then they enter the upside down world. We build up tension until the midpoint scene, and at the midpoint scene, everything sort of changes. The hero's world gets rocked, and then we have this breakdown section, chapters, I can do math, 20 to 30. It's easy math, too, wow. So we have this breakdown situation where the hero is having to deal with the truth of their dilemma in this. And this is one of the coolest acts, I think. I think that Alan Watt says Act 3 is suffering and surrender. And that's when the epiphany happens. Technically, that would be the beginning of Act 3, epiphany. They actually see reality. So we've got this breakdown act. The world is rocked. They're breaking down. They're having trouble. They see the truth, or if it's a negative arc, if they're, going down a bad road, like in Sicario or something like that, they see the truth and it's bad. And then in here we have the climax. It's sort of the, whatever happened way back here in the disruption, it gets paid off up here. I think that's what Sean Coyne calls it. He calls it payoff. And so in here we have the final battle with whatever they're dealing with. This can very easily be the final battle with some demon inside of them, or the final battle in Pursuit of Happiness, he gets the job and he's, it's going to be okay. Let's go back to Act 1 real quick and just sort of fill this out before I actually turn this into a scene-by-scene breakdown, and I show you how I go through and actually begin a story with this. So Act 1, setup, disruption, opposition. It's this first quarter here, these first 10 chapters, and the setup and the opposition sort of lie on either side of this, and they're cut by the disruption. So you can have an early disruption or you can have a late disruption, and that really just depends on how much you need to set up. You know, if you have a lot to set up, if you're doing a big fantasy world, if you're Robert Jordan or Brandon Sanderson, you might need a lot of this time to set up. But I would never do it later than, that's not exactly, I would never do it later than like 15% of the way in. Late disruption. An early disruption, you can go in as early as, say, 6 or 7%. I think Abby Emmons recommends 7% is going to be an early disruption just to get you in, to get you really just dunked into the story as quickly as you possibly can. Just understand that if you do that, then you may have to continue, and you're writing fantasy, for example, like I do, you may have to do a little extra retroactive setup in the middle here while you're dealing with opposition or the argument. So at the beginning, we're setting up the character, we're meeting the character, we're learning what they want and what they're afraid of, and what a stressful but regular day in their life looks like. And then the disruption happens. And then the rest of it is the argument or the opposition. And so you have, like, this is what sort of reveals to us how good your dilemma is. Whatever the hero ends up wanting and doing at the very end is one side of the dilemma. And that dilemma, if it's strong enough, then the antagonist could, in theory, have their own story where they're the hero. And that starts as early as this. We start to see opposition to the character's point of view. So we got this setup section. The argument, oftentimes it includes the refusal of the call. You know, if you're using the Dan Harmon story embryo or the hero's journey or something like that, which is, you know, also 3-act structure. So yeah, I mean, you have the argument, the refusal or denial, you know, and then you have, there is no going back home, you know. There is no going back to the status quo. It is disrupted forever. You know, Luke can't go back to the moisture farm because his aunt and uncle have been killed by the Empire. So, point of no return and into the upside down world. Now, the upside down world can look like a bunch of different things. I mean, it can look like trials. It can look like troubles. You know, you're looking at complications. You're looking at learning their powers if it's like Spider-Man. You know, Lost in the Woods. If we're going on the superhero kick, Batman training, you know, in Batman Begins, he's going through a hard time in his life, right? And then this all sort of leads up. You also have in here false victory or false hope. And that's an important part for this, is like make sure that you're looking at levity, make sure you're looking at like it's not all doom and gloom. The hero comes to the midpoint, their whole world changes. And then this is sort of breakdown. This is what am I gonna do? Could be what this part is called. And you have suffering. In order for the character to transform, the character is going to need to suffer. And then that suffering leads them to surrender in some way. And that could be they surrender, they say, I'm, you know, like in Shrek, you know, I don't want to be a part of this story anymore. I'm just going to live in my swamp and be alone, and I don't want you around because I've got my swamp back. And that's the surrender moment. I give up. This whole story thing that's been going on, I don't like it anymore, and I'm giving up. But it could also look like, I am surrendering my beliefs, or I'm admitting something, I'm admitting my secret. I think Ellen Brock talks about Toy Story, how there's this sort of surrender moment of like Woody says, he's giving Buzz advice, but he is also going through his own sort of surrender epiphany moment at the same time as he gives that speech in real time, sort of Shakespeare style. I'm realizing this in the moment and I'm saying it out loud to you, but I'm actually changing my own life as well. So suffering, surrender, and then the epiphany. This is how things really are. This epiphany moment, it can actually go a little later if you want. The 75%, the last point of no return, it sends them right into the final battle. And, it sends them right into the final battle. And so you have this, I know what I need to do. I'm going to step into the ring and I can't turn back anymore. And now I'm in the final battle. And then you have all the resolution. This is the climax. This is the climax. This is the most intense moment of action in your whole story. I think a lot of people, when they talk about climax, they're actually talking about the midpoint scene. When in reality, the climax, the moment of most intensity, is the final battle. If you define a climax the way that Stanislavski did, then you might look at the Freytag. You might look at the midpoint and say that's the climax, because for them the climax is the moment where the story turns and where the hero has either it's where the hero changes direction. They change the direction of the story. But I think that it's much better to think of, the intensity is actually going up, 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 and then it drops. And then you can create like different peaks and valleys within this, it goes up and then it goes down, and then it goes up and it goes down, and then whatever. Do not follow this graph. Yeah, so this is the basics of story structure. I mean, after the climax, we have a couple different things, like aftermath. Did they win or did they lose? Is this a tragedy, or, is it all going to be okay? And then I like to have like aftermath. I want to see a little bit of what's going to happen in the future. Tigana has one of my favorite of all time Act 4s, the book Tigana by Guy Gabriel Kay. It's well worth a read. I really don't like its Act 3, frankly, and it's still one of my favorite books of all time, because Act 1 to Act 4, the whole course of the story is insane. Get that book. Something else that I like to include is Alan Watt begins with an opening image, and he closes with a closing image. And I love this because it lets me be a little bit abstract. All right, so let's clean this up. That's the long version of this. I'm going to clean this up, and we are going to write out what the scenes are. So, split it in half, midpoint. Quarter of the way through. Let's call it gate. It's the gate of it's the point of no return. And right here, let's call this a gate. We can use whatever, whatever terminology we want, even if I want to call this point of no return and stepping into the ring. All right, and then we've got some sort of disruption. We're writing fantasy, so let's say it's a late disruption at like 15%. This dissects Act 1. So we've got the first, I don't know, let's say 15% of our book. It's going to be set up. The disruption happens. And then 10% opposition. Point of no return. we have the upside down world. You know, in Liar Liar, this is him learning that he can't lie for some reason, and it's ruining his life in all these ways that were set up early on. Here, we have the midpoint, which changes everything. And then we have breakdown. Somewhere around here, we have, you know, let's break these down. Temptation, commitment. Those can almost happen line after line. I would highly recommend keeping these in the same scene. And then later on, we have suffering. We've got surrender. And then we have epiphany, which leads to gate 2. You know, we have the hero realizing reality and taking a decision. I think that's why those are called plot points, honestly, is because they are the moments where the character makes a decision. In here, we have, this is stepping into the ring, so then we have battle, victory or defeat, aftermath. And of course, we have opening image and closing image. And that's the basics of structure. These are a series of scenes. Let me focus in on that. This is a series of scenes and arcs that you can use to structure a story. And I just want to note that this can be physical or this can be emotional. And usually if it's emotional, it also has some sort of ethical element to it. And this is how you map this out. You know, this is an increase in intensity. World gets a lot more intense, way worse. Things are very, very bad. And then you have the final battle and whatever the aftermath is. Boom. In the next video, I'll actually take this structure and I'll show you which scenes I write in which order. Because I don't start at the beginning. I start at the midpoint and I do a few other sketches of scenes, and I do these because they're the most important scenes. When I'm thinking about the shape of a story, the midpoint is always the sort of juicy heart of it, because it's the moment that the character realizes what the true nature of their dilemma is. Anyways, I think the midpoint is the most important place to start. And then there are a few other things that I sort of use as freeze frames, because this whole story structure, it's the structure of a character's transformation over time, or their inability to transform over time, and how that ends badly for them in most cases, in basically all cases, with a few exceptions, of course. I'll get into that more in depth in the next video, and then I would love to show you how I use this to actually outline a story, and then I'll actually write that story and release it so that you can see this is how it began, and this is what it ended up looking like, for better or for worse. You know, you may see that and say, I never want to use this structure because this story sucks, but you'll have the information, you know, I don't know. It could turn out like that, frankly. Anyways, thanks for listening to me ramble. That's basically everything that I know and use about story structure. Later on, we'll also get into how to outline a scene, if you like to outline a scene. And with scene outlining, I just want to note, do that in your head. When you're playing around with that, you still have these things like there's a disruption in the scene, there's some sort of upside down world or complication in the scene. The character is turning the story at the midpoint, and then, you know, the dilemma is a crisis as a question. You know, so the crisis for Frodo, if I keep on going with this one example, is what are his two options? Sean Coyne says, you know, your crisis is either the best of two bad things, or there are two good things, but only one of them can happen. And so you have to choose which good thing to do. Irreconcilable goods. But either way, you've got two choices, and your action is what chooses your side of the dilemma. Your action is what chooses which side of the crisis you're on. And so in a scene, this is super, super, super useful, because in a scene, you have the crisis in the middle of the scene, the midpoint, and then when the character commits, that's actually the climax of the scene. That's the character choosing to do something. It's the character saying this road and not that road. Frodo, before the midpoint, he has a crisis. Do I go back home and be safe? Or do I basically commit suicide but do the right thing and sacrifice myself and maybe sacrifice ever seeing my home again? And what you see him wondering, you see him thinking, you assume he's wondering, you assume he's mulling over this crisis. And the way that he decides is he says, I'll do it, I'll take the ring to Mordor. And that puts him on that road forever. Once he's done that, and I just want to note that, like, when you're on the scene level, when you've got that climax has to be animal. And that's one of the things that makes it really feel like I see a character make a decision and like my stomach drops because they are acting as an animal would. Like I have this problem and I have to do something right now, and then they do it. Just, it gives me chills how cool it is. Oh man. Yeah. We'll write a story with this next time. Thank you so much for hanging out. I appreciate you.